this episode of the Big Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yep, very, very much appreciated. I think probably the first and the last independent indie episode of Bamor that I'll probably have the opportunity to do, given that indie bottlings of Bamor are now as rare as hen's teeth. So anyway, that was last week. So this week, this week's episode is a long overdue episode, it has to be said, and it's often the way, you know, I get sent samples and I think, yeah, I'm really going to do an episode of the show with them, and in this instance it was the Henstone single Rioja cask bottling, and I just haven't managed to get to shoehorn it into an episode. You know, the trouble is when you have single samples, it's like, well, you either have to wait until you've got half a dozen together, or you can have some kind of theme, which I suppose today's episode is again English whiskey, I suppose, or you kind of do just a random episode, and of course I'm only doing one episode a week. It's quite hard, so apologies to Pocketful of Stones that this review is sort of long overdue, but I'm doing it now, so everything's cool, isn't it? So as you can see from the title page, we're looking at two English distilleries, and one obviously the Henstone. Both of these distilleries, obviously I've done episodes of the show on before, so I don't need to go into any great deal of history or anything like that. So we're looking at obviously the Henstone Distillery in Shropshire, in Westry, I think is where it's based, and obviously we're looking at a couple of bottlings from Pocketful of Stones Distillery in Cornwall. So yeah, I think obviously the two distilleries are actually quite sort of comparable. I mean, small craft producers. I know, horrible term. You know, so I think there's obviously they've got quite a sort of a lot in common in essence. So that's why I thought sort of putting the two of them together for an episode of the show was actually quite logical at the end of the day. God, me, logic, wow. Anyway, so I don't think I need to sort of, like I said, say anything more about the actual distilleries. I have done episodes of the show on them in the past, so if you want to find out a bit more, you can always watch them. There are links to the individual distilleries' websites in the box below, so just going to introduce today's lineup. Right, okay, so obviously before we start, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Henry at Henstone Distillery and to Ilona at Pocketful of Stones for all the samples for today's episode of the show. Like I said, guys, apologies that it's been so long in coming, but hopefully you'll like what I have to say. So we're going to kick off with Henstone, or certainly the first bottling. It's their Ex-Bourbon cask. Aged in 200 litre American Standard barrel. This is a sample of release number 4, which was actually a single cask bottling, HDC 0005. Now the nice thing about Henstone, as I probably mentioned in the previous episode of the show, is if you go onto the website, they have a full breakdown of each of the releases, what cask numbers go into it, why they used them, all this. Apparently this was a single cask because it was leaking and they needed to bottle it. So anyway, so it was distilled in April of 2018, bottled in April of 2022 at the grand old age of 4 years old. So let's see what that one's like. Second bottling we're going to be looking at is the Henstone Rioja cask. Now it was a single cask bottling, although they didn't say what the cask number was. Maybe they don't use cask numbers. That'd be a bit different, I suppose. Bottled at 46%. Incidentally, the Henstone is 43.8. So their first actual proper Cornish single malt. Obviously you may well know that they do have a standard release, which, although does contain some of their own whiskey, is vatted with 8-year-old Loch Lomond. So, you know, some people have argued, well, it's not really a Cornish whiskey if you're vatting it together with some Scottish whiskey, and well, yeah, okay, they have a bit of a point, I suppose. But the way I look at it is I would much rather a distillery do something like that to release a product that's actually ready for drinking, rather than rush out a product of their own which isn't ready for drinking just because they need to get some revenue in or a bottling out there. But this is 100% Cornish distilled whisky. There was a mash made from the Celtic brewery. As you know, they don't actually make their own mash. They basically use a couple of local breweries that produce, give them the beer to basically make their wort from. So triple distilled, aged in a Rioja cask, distilled in May of 2018 and bottled in May of 2022, again at 4 years of age. Then we're going to move back to Henstone. These are the sort of extension, I suppose, to the range. This is the Ex-Oloroso cask aged. Now, as a sample, I don't know, or a sort of miniature, don't know which release it is. The release at the time that I got this pack was, I think, number 2. Bottled at 46% this time, and sort of initially aged in 200 litre ex-American standard barrels, I believe, from Jim Beam, and then finished for 8 months in 125 litre Oloroso quarter casks. So we'll see what the balance between the two cask types and the spirit is like with that one. The next bottling in their sort of extension of the range is the Ex-Pedro Ximinez cask aged, 46% again, roughly the same aging. Yes, I think it is the same aging. So few years in Jim Beam ASBs, and then 8 months in 125 litre Ex-Pedro Ximinez, can't talk, Ex-Pedro Ximinez quarter casks. And these samples came to me, I think it was in November of last year, when we were at the Nottingham Whisky Festival, and actually there was because the Henstone's sort of stand was right next to where we were. It was actually quite busy, and we did sell quite a few of their bottles, and in essence, and I think yeah, they were doing some good business. And a certain whisky merchant that employs me is actually going to have a Henstone tasting evening on the 20th of September. I think there's still tickets available, so I imagine they'll be showing these 4 along with maybe a couple of surprises. So I think that would be really quite cool. Anyway, the next bottling is the Ex-Peated cask aged, again 46%, again aged initially in 200 litre American standard barrels, and then 7 months in 125 litre Ex-Peated quarter casks from, well, I imagine either from Laphroaig or they've created them themselves. I honestly don't know, but let's assume ex-Laphroaig quarter casks. And then to finish off, we're back to the Henstone Distillery, and not Henstone, sorry, Pocketful of Stones Distillery, and this is their finest Cornish cider brandy, Smugglers Reserve, bottled at 40%. It's made from various Cornish cider producers' cider, and then double distilled and aged for, I don't know the exact length of time, but aged for a period of time in oak casks. And I don't know what the casks are, probably ex-American oak, maybe ex their own, I don't know, probably, it would make sense. And it's interesting because the first bottling they did of a cider brandy was a Screech cider brandy, as you may well recall from when I did the episode of the show on them. That bottling doesn't seem to be around anymore, and it's now just this one. I'm guessing that Screech obviously couldn't supply them with enough cider to keep making that particular bottling, which is why they've now moved on to this one, which is a kind of, you know, uses up a number of different producers' ciders, so they can probably keep bottling it at a more regular pace, I suppose. Anyway, so an interesting episode of the show coming up, I think. So let's kick off with the Henstone then. Right, okay, so let's see what the Ex-Bourbon cask bottling gives us then, shall we? That's a nice nose, actually. Soft. Nice barleyed entry. There's a little bit of an edginess there. There's some citric notes, a little bit of green fruit, a slight astringency, honey, some pleasant oak. It's really nicely balanced. The oak is becoming a little bit more creamy as you give it some time in the glass, and you know, for a 4-year-old, I think that's actually a really nice whisky. Okay, it's not mega complex, but I think it sort of displays what the distillery is attempting to do. It's not overly estery, but there's some nice fruit there. It's barley centred, it's balanced with the wood, and it's not particularly expensive from memory, so I think that's a lovely nose. Yeah, well, getting a little bit of white fruit now, a little bit of apple possibly. Yeah, I like this nose. This is a nice whiskey. Let's see what the palate's like. Kicks off with the oak. It's slightly creamy, and although it's noticeable, I wouldn't say it's obtrusive. It's again quite balanced. You sort of move through the oak into the barley, citrus, a little stony minerality, a little bit of a hoppiness as well, kind of coming through on the mid palate, and then we move back into the oak. It's got a little bit of bittering. Again, and then finishing off right on the aftertaste, coming back to the barley. There's a slight edginess there, slight spiciness from the oak. I think that's actually a lovely palate. I mean, again, it's not hugely complex, but it has a lovely progression, and I think that is just as important in my opinion. I like a whiskey to sort of like, you know, unfold and kind of take me on a journey. I know, naff connotations I suppose, but it's true. I don't want a whiskey just to basically sort of, you know, land everything on my palate in one go, and I'm having to go, what the hell is going on here? You know, I like it to unwind and start with one thing, move into another area, and, you know, come back to something else possibly. And in this case, starts off with the oak, moves into the barley and the citrus, returns to the oak, a little bit of spice. All told, I think that's a really good whiskey. All I say is I want you here. Okay, so let's move on to the Henstone Rioja cask. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Now, the Rioja cask is very subtle. I mean, how long did it spend in that cask? 6 months maybe? 3 months? Quite hoppy. Almost got an IPA kind of like character. I mean, is that because the beer that was used to make the mash was an IPA? Possibly. It's got some nice juicy fruit, some spice, a little bit of estery apricot. I mean, they have set their stall out to make a relatively estery wort. I believe I can't remember how long the fermentation lasts for, but I think it's several days. So it's putting it into the sort of estery, fruity end sort of wort to start off with, and certainly you get a lovely kind of apricot, pineapple, sort of pineapple chunks. Sort of maybe tinned pineapple chunks, a little bit of syrup, some red fruit. I mean, that's lovely. It's really well balanced. It's fruity. Now, of course, the sort of the elephant in the room with this was the retail price, which is 3 figures. And okay, I can understand what it is. It's their first release. It's a single cask, etc., etc. Is it quite worth that? I grapple with that. It has to be said. It's a nice whiskey, but the elephant is in the room. Anyway, but I like the nose. I think the nose is really balanced. I think they're doing a superb job. Let's see what the palate's like. I like that. Really hoppy again. Hoppy, almost tasting that bitter hop note right on the aftertaste. But it kicks off with a more sweeter hoppy kind of note, more American hops. Juicy red fruit, barley, a little bit of earth, some citrus, little bittering from the oak. Again, really nicely balanced. And you know what it has me in mind of? A less weird Corsair bottling. For those of you that probably don't know or remember Corsair, I'm assuming they're still making whiskey. They were kind of a bit of a maverick, distillery? Yeah, maverick distillery in the States, and they did all manner of weird stuff, like sort of, you know, they had an IPA mash whiskey they produced. I think they did a stout mash as well, and they were doing some all manner of weird stuff well before any of the other sort of distilleries were sort of doing weird stuff. Some of it, well, probably didn't work quite as well as others, and it was a bit weird and wacky, it has to be said, and it kind of puts me in the mind of that type of thing that they were doing, but less weird, more approachable, more drinkable, it has to be said. And you know what? I like that. I think it's a lovely balance to it. Again, the oak isn't too heavy-handed. It's not too much of the Rioja cask, and it's just really, really nicely balanced. Price, possibly a bit of an issue, but you know, that obviously I'd leave you up to decide whether that was something you'd be comfortable with, sort of like parting with 3 figures for. But on just tasting the whiskey itself, really, really good. Okay, so let's move on to the Ex-Oloroso cask aged. See what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Now it kind of has that that Welsh boiled sweets kind of sherry character. It's not the leafy herbal Oloroso. It's that boiled sweets confectionery kind of character. It's got dried fruit, you know, dried citrus. I'm getting dried orange, sultana. We're more in the lighter end of the dried fruit spectrum, dried apricot and orange and sultana, as opposed to the darker raisinated fruit. There's a little bit of vanilla. It's okay. It's a little heavy on the Oloroso, it has to be said. There's some buttery oak influence, but I don't get a great deal of spirit character, and I don't get a great deal of barley. So what we have here really is an exercise in wood, basically, and it is skewed more towards the Oloroso side of things, which is fine if you like this type of whiskey. Me personally, obviously, as you well know, and you know, if the sort of, you know, I want balance. I want to sort of like get some kind of spirit character. I don't get it in this. I just get basically oak. Anyway, let's see what that's like. Soft, oaky again, quite buttery, but then you've got this sort of raisinated fruit, sort of sultana. There's maybe a little darker on the palate, a little bit more raisins. It's a little bit of youthfulness, spirit-wise, kind of coming through. It doesn't feel as kind of now, although obviously the Ex-Bourbon cask wasn't what I would call a mature whiskey, but it was, you know, ready. This has got a sort of just a sort of an edge of kind of rose petal mar right on the finish. It's not intrusive, and I think, you know, if you weren't really sort of analysing it too deeply, you probably wouldn't pick it up. And it doesn't kind of mar the experience, but it's a bit simplistic. It's a bit woody. And I don't get any real distillery character or spirit character apart from that little bit of raw mar on the finish. So for me, I'm not really blown away by that. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Ex-Pedro Ximinez cask. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? That's a PX cask, there's no doubting that whatsoever. Floral dried fruits, quite raisinated, dried grape, burnt toast, treacle by the absolute bucketful, coffee, and that's it basically. It's just Pedro Ximinez. It's just sherry. I don't get even, there's no iota of American oak coming through, certainly no spirit character. But then again, this is a malt that's been made for people that like this type of whiskey. Now, you know, just because I don't particularly enjoy this type of whiskey, I'm not going to say it's a bad whiskey, because it's very clean, no sulphur blemishes, absolutely pristine. And for a Pedro Ximinez, finished whiskey. If you like, Glendronach, for example, you're going to love this. You're going to absolutely love this. But for me, it's just Pedro Ximinez, really. Anyway, let's sort of pass on. Treacly, quite tannic, burnt toast on the mid palate, and again, right on the very. I mean, it's more kind of herbal PX, quite sweet. I wouldn't go quite as far as saying sickly. No, that's the wrong word. Scrub that. Didn't say that. Sugary is what I meant to say. It's quite a sugary kind of finish. But it's also quite herbal, and again, like with the Oloroso, I'm getting that slightly raw rose petal sort of spirit note right on the very end of the aftertaste, which kind of says to me that it was, I wouldn't say bottled too soon. I would have left it longer in the American oak before. I mean, it feels like it's only roughly about 3 years old. It could be 4, but even so, it probably could have done with a little bit more time in the American oak before being finished, and I would have finished it personally for a lot less time. Either use refill quarters or something like that, but then again, this is not my whiskey, and I'd be doing it for my taste, and obviously my taste isn't everybody's taste. Life would be boring if everybody had exactly the same taste. So obviously there's going to be some of you guys out there that will absolutely love this stuff. For me, it was just a little bit too one-dimensional, but still a really good quality product. Okay, let's move on to the Ex-Peated cask. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Slightly medicinal, astringent green fruit, quite a lot of peat in actual fact. It always amazes me how much, it doesn't amaze me how much influence the cask has. An Ex-Oloroso quarter or something like that will have quite a bit of influence. But it just, I don't know, it just always amazes me how much peated cask influence it has. And it just goes to show, obviously, how much of the previous liquid that's been in the cask has been absorbed into the wood. And when you think about it, you think, well, I've just tasted the PX one. It's been 8 months in a PX quarter, and it's just practically all PX. So why wouldn't a spirit that's been aged in sort of, for what, 7 months in an ex-peated cask not have the same kind of influence? And it does. But here's the slight difference. It's not a monstrous peat. It's a soft peat. It's a sort of a gentle peat. Again, we've got some elements of the sort of slightly of the barley. We've got some citrus. Nice light layer of honey as well. And overall, balance is really, really good, I think. Let's see what it smells like. Opens up with the barley and the citrus, and the peat moves in a fairly slow fashion, sort of into the mid palate. It's quite ashy, a little bit of a herbal note, no real medicinal notes, but ashy is the impression I get. A little bit of green apple. It fades really quite nicely. I don't quite get the sort of the raw spirit note on the aftertaste that I did with both the PX and the Oloroso. Maybe it's just sort of a little older, the spirit. Maybe it's a little older than the spirit in the other two bottlings. Maybe it's just a bit better integrated. Maybe, the wood notes in the PX and the Oloroso just sort of tail off a bit too soon. I like that. I think that's really good, and it's sort of becoming a bit of a sort of a trend now for distilleries that don't want to go the whole hog and do the sort of the entire peated mash and a peated run to do this kind of thing. I mean, obviously it was started by the Penderyn distillery all those years ago, 20 odd years ago. Can you believe that? And it's something that's obviously sort of carried on, and why not? It's different. It's interesting. Some people argue it's a sort of like, you know, a bit of a cheat. It's a poor man's kind of peated spirit. Well, at the end of the day, like I said, it's the juice in the bottle that counts. How the juice gets there, what process it goes through, at the end of the day, it, although it's important to a certain extent, is unimportant at the end of the day, because, you know, you're not drinking sort of like a process, you're drinking the end product. And how it gets to that point doesn't really matter at the end of the day, as long as it tastes good. And, you know, I like that. I think that was a good bottle. Right, okay, so on to the final bottling of the day. This is the Smugglers Reserve Cornish Cider Brandy. Let's see what the nose gives us. Raw, youthful, intense. It certainly reminds me of some naturally made ciders that I've had at beer festivals in the past. I do not do cider at all. It really does not agree with me. All that acidity. And it's kind of, yeah, really sort of intense, astringent green apple. It's quite Calvados-like. You remember the Calvados episode I did sort of not so long ago. It's kind of, it says more Calvados than cider brandy. Cider brandy to me is like their screech cider brandy. It tends to be a little bit more fuller, fleshier. I mean, obviously a lot of it's going to possibly be influenced by what apples are used to make the initial cider before being distilled. There's a nice spiciness there. Like I said, it's a real dead ringer for a Calvados, really, at the end of the day. Lovely intensity. Let's see what that parts like. That's very cidery, quite astringent, sort of almost acerbic. Again, very Calvados-like, crisp, fresh, green apple. It's pleasant. It is what like I said, it's a very good simulacrum to, I would say, to a Calvados. It's not very much a cider brandy as I would see a cider brandy. It doesn't quite have the flesh, and it doesn't quite have the sort of like the roundness of a cider brandy for me personally. So it's more like a Calvados in my eyes. But you know, it's good. It's interesting. It's I mean, it doesn't lack intensity. I can tell you that for a start. So if you like that kind of thing, yeah, that's pretty good. Nice way to end, I think. Yeah, don't give a damn. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. So firstly, a big thank you to both the distilleries for the samples for today's episode of the show. Very, very much appreciated. And like I said, we will be having, or Gauntley's will be having, a Henstone tasting evening in the shop on the 20th of September. So if you want to come along and try them in the flesh, so to speak, then please book a ticket. So I think for me the most interesting of the Henstone lineups was the Ex-Bourbon cask. I mean, well, no surprise there really, is there? It gives you everything that the distillery is trying to say and do. It gives it to you on a plate with a little bit of oak, a balance. And that's all you can really ask for at the end of the day. The Henstone Rioja cask, again, a lovely whiskey, balanced, really pleasant, really intense. Not overly Rioja, shall we say, but of course the elephant in the room, as I mentioned, was the price tag. The Oloroso cask and the Pedro Ximinez cask aged, obviously you can group together as being overtly influenced by the quarter cask of said name. Too one-dimensional for my personal taste, good quality nevertheless, and if you like that kind of thing, then obviously that would certainly tick your boxes. The peated cask, I liked that. Again, I thought the balance was better, it did allow some other characteristics other than the peat to kind of come through. So yeah, wins all round for me. And the cider brandy, yeah, I mean, lovely cider brandy. Again, like I said, to me, I prefer the cider brandies that tend to have a little bit more sort of fleshy kind of cidery kind of character. But you know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. Like I said, very much more in the style of a French Calvados. So you kind of pick your poison with regards to that. So yeah, there you go. That's this week's episode of The Show in the Bag. I hope you all have enjoyed it, and I guess there's nothing else to say apart from good afternoon and good dram.